You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Good morning and welcome to the Be Better Off Show, where here at Kelly+Partners, we go and find amazing Australians who can help us be healthier, wealthier and wiser. Now, this morning, we've got a terrific guest, Dominique Lamb, who's the CEO of the National Retail Association. And I want to share some of her background because it's really interesting. In 2011, Australian Institute of Management's Young Gun of the Year Award, 2016 finalist in the Brisbane Women in Business Awards, 2020 Dominique was a finalist in the Telstra Business Women of the Year Awards for Purpose and Social Enterprise. She studied law and employment relations. She's a passionate advocate for victims of domestic violence and works as the president and previously vice president of the Women's Legal Service in Queensland. She now has been a director of the National Retail Association and continues in that role, but is now the CEO of the National Retail Association. Now, for our listeners, the National Retail Association, not-for-profit organisation that represents the interests of retailers across Australia to support, inform, protect and represent the interests of these retailers and fast food businesses. So they're working on the issues and opportunities facing retailers every day. It is awesome to have Dominique with us this morning. Good morning, Dominique.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you joining us. And I know just before we started recording, you were talking to Megan from our team. Shout out to Megan, who does a great job, about growing up in Sydney. You grew up in Campbelltown in Sydney?
I did, yes.
Brothers, sisters, mum and dad?
Yeah, yes, I have a half sister who lives in Melbourne. So she's 13 years younger than me. And I grew up predominantly with my mum, who was a single mum and was basically cared for by my very, very Dutch grandparents, my Oma and Opa, who lived in Lamia. So I spent most of my time within their home, where they'd almost created this, little Dutch shrine, even to the point my grandmother would turn the air conditioning on Christmas Day so that it felt like it was snowing outside. So, that was kind of me. I went to John Terry Catholic High School in Rosemeadow, and then went on to Wollongong Uni and studied law after all of that. So.
Great. So you go off to university, and I always think it's interesting, where people intend to end up and where they do end up and how they get there. I love to ask people about that. You're studying law at Wollongong, great place to study, beautiful beaches. Where did you think you were going to go? You did a law degree for what reason?
I wanted to help people. That's the reason I got into law, which is quite interesting because when you start studying law, you realise that most people that get into law isn't necessarily to help people. So I always think there are two different types of people that practice law, lawyers and then humans that practice law. And I categorise myself as one of those humans. So I was very, very much interested in all of those areas that were kind of human-based, industrial relations, family law, criminal law, anything that kind of had a human element or story. But I thought that I would go into a law practice and become a partner, and then potentially a barrister, and that's kind of it. That's really what I thought I would do. So this career change obviously was a bit of a surprise to me.
So what happened? What did you do immediately out of university?
I became a building and construction lawyer, funnily enough. And so I went and worked for a business called Doyle's Construction Lawyers. And at the time, the Fair Work Act came into play and no one in that office really had much experience with it. Obviously, it was new legislation, but also because they were construction. And at the time, I think it was about the GFC. So there were a lot of redundancies happening and I sort of fell into this industrial practice, cross building and construction practice, and then was approached by a middle-sized legal practice in Queensland and decided to move from Sydney to Brisbane to work with them, and ended up, basically building them a practice of industrial relations within Brisbane within a couple of years, and then kind of moved on from there.
Great. So it's, it sounds like nothing, and certainly today, moving from one state to another, particularly if you're a Victorian, obviously something that would be easy to contemplate. We're recording this session today in the middle of another Victorian COVID lockdown, but jumping from Sydney to Brisbane is a big move. You move your whole life. How did you make that change, and why was that? Was it easy? Why was it easy? Was it hard?
I think surprisingly easy for me. I really enjoy change. I think that it keeps you active, and you learn lots of new things from that. And at the time, I was about 24 years old. I'd done quite a bit of traveling at that point, through Europe and Asia and all sorts of things like that. So moving from kind of Sydney to Brisbane didn't feel like a big move. And I was excited about the fact that, I'd be in a bigger law practice. And when you're a baby lawyer, you kind of, you base your value on the size of the practice that you work for. So going from kind of boutique building a construction practice to somewhere like Mackay's Solicitors was quite exciting because, they had over 100 staff and they had a couple of offices, and, they were really kind of well structured and they had lots of partners. And for me, it was about, where am I going to go next? And that presented as a really good opportunity.
Great. So you're in Brisbane. How do you end up in your current role?
So funnily enough, I decided to jump to a bigger practice. And what I soon learnt was that is not always a good idea, depending on the culture of the practice. And the culture of the firm didn't really suit me. And I actually became quite ill. And so I ended up having radiation on my thyroid. And I decided to go in-house and work for Australian Industry Group for an incredible man by the name of David Miller, who just renewed my faith in lawyers. And I really enjoyed getting to know businesses kind of from the inside out. So as an industry association, you have a very different relationship with your clients. They typically call you and tell you things a lot earlier than what you would normally hear as a lawyer. It's not as reactive. And you spend a lot of time out in their businesses and things like that. So I was quite ill. I went there to kind of rebuild my work-life balance. And to do that, I decided that I would start bodybuilding. And I went into kind of low-end bodybuilding in those bikini levels and joined a bodybuilding team. And part of that team was that they kind of rebuilt your psychology through sports psychology. And they looked at, what are your non-negotiables? Where do you want to be? Who are you surrounding yourself with? How does your whole life operate, kind of from when you get up in the morning through to the end of your day? And through that process, and also through power posing, my self-esteem increased quite significantly. So I was approached by a contact of mine to apply for the head of legal at the National Retail Association. And my first reaction was, oh, they need somebody else. You need someone who's got more experience. And they said, no, I think they need you. And so I went through this interview process thinking, oh, they'll never offer it to me, but I'll introduce them to other people in my network that would be a good fit. In the end, they did offer it to me. And I decided, well, what's the worst that could happen? If you can get up in front of 300 people not wearing a hell of a lot of clothing, you can absolutely do this. And so I took the role. And then within 12 months of being the head of NRA's legal practice, our CEO was pre-selected to federal politics, and the board asked me to step into that role. And again, I had the same reaction. You probably need somebody else. However, the difference at that time was that our board are very involved in our business, and I had developed some very significant mentor relationships. And through those relationships, I felt comfortable enough to take that role, and they supported me, on that journey. And now I've been the CEO for about 6 years.
Great. Gosh, that's a great story. There's a lot of good
What to unpack there.
Yeah, that's really, really great. Who was the CEO that was pre-selected, Dominique?
Trevor Evans, so the member
Trevor
for
Evans.
Brisbane. Yeah.
Great.
He's
Now,
the Minister in Environment, I think, at the moment.
very interesting. So let's go back. So firstly, you pass over, in professional practice generally, and certainly in legal practice, there's a lot of people who are stressed and bothered and unhealthy. What do you say to the young lawyer as to how you ended up in that state?
I think that there is an expectation, certainly in larger firms, that almost as if, and hopefully this has changed because I haven't been in one for a long time, but at the time there was almost a treatment of people as battery hens. You go into your office, you wouldn't leave that office during the day, even into the evening, and the expectation was that you were available kind of 24 hours a day, which, I think we all have now with email on our phones and all sorts of things, especially working from home. But I think what I would say is, it's about some of those non-negotiables in what time am I going to make for myself, and what priorities am I going to have for my own health. And that includes regular eating, consuming water, getting enough sleep, exercising, and just things that bring you joy in your life. And I found that when I was in that environment, the one thing that was actually bringing me joy was my volunteer work with Women's Legal Service. It wasn't actually my job. And that is actually what got me through that, what was a very difficult time, because of, my health, because I felt like I couldn't give the practice 100%. And also, just simply getting through life, I think.
You're only a very young person at this point, like you're 25 or 26.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So it's very early to develop essentially a work-related illness through stress and bother.
Yeah.
Which is, and it's not uncommon. And I think for our listeners, it's probably, worth hearing that it happens, and it happens a lot even to high-achieving, intelligent people. But when you go into, I think the bodybuilding story is really interesting. I played a lot of sport, and I still think that has helped me a lot. Run us through these. I was writing them down. So, core non-negotiables. Who do you want to be? Who do you surround yourself with? The power of the power pose. That was my line. So what happens? Like who says to a young female lawyer, and by the way, I think you should bulk up and join the bodybuilding team?
Yeah, nobody. I was a marathon runner, so I was running. I had never lifted anything in my life. I had no interest in lifting anything. I was literally just running on a treadmill pretty much like my whole life, outside of this. And I injured my knee, I think, at the time. It wasn't a major injury or anything like that, but I decided that I would do an 8-week course with a personal trainer that I was working with that was really, he was very focused on CrossFit. And I started doing kind of regular weights and things like that with him. And because I like to have a goal, I was like, okay, what can you do with this? And via social media, I came across this incredible woman by the name of Cleo Brown, and who is now, I think, Cleo Evangelou. And she ran a gym called Olympia in Brisbane, and it was all surrounding bodybuilding. And I was like, I want to go meet this woman because I loved her messaging. I loved how positive she was. And I felt quite drawn to that. So I found their gym, and I, had a consultation with one of their PTs, which was very, very different from any other personal training I'd ever experienced, in the sense that they wanted to know kind of everything about you, what you wanted to achieve, how you wanted to do it, all of those things before they would even kind of take you on as a client. And you would also have a meeting with her where you would sign a charter of how you would interact with other people in the gym, because it wasn't like normal gyms. You would go in, everyone would say hello to you. They knew you by name. They knew things about you. Everybody was welcome. It didn't matter what you looked like. It didn't matter how experienced you were. It didn't matter if you had previously trained. They would take you on and they would put you on stage because they thought, whatever was best kind of for the client. And I love that. I became really addicted to this kind of family environment that was all based on your wellness. And they had these incredible communities where you could talk about work, and you could talk about, if you were single, there were single mixer nights and things like that where you would meet other like-minded people. And I really enjoyed that. But the one thing I think from that experience that really shaped all of this was they got you to pick 5 words that you would, hold yourself accountable to. And these words were almost aspirational, and they were words about how you wanted other people to view you. And obviously they change over time, but holding yourself accountable to those words became a real kind of point for me that shifted how I did everything. So for instance, if one of your words was compassionate, you would question yourself as to whether or not a compassionate person would act this way, whether a driven person would, hit snooze instead of getting up and going to the gym, whether, whatever your words were. And I loved that accountability. And that's really kind of what set the journey on its path.
So do you still have your 5 power words?
I don't have
you
them.
Renew them or keep them, or
I renew them, and so I have recently been looking at renewing them. And normally they sit on the screen of my phone so that I see them all the time. But they're pretty consistent for me in that they always include kind. I want to be a kind person, a calm person, a driven person, and the other two at the moment are just kind of, the jury's out. I still haven't kind of fixed on those words yet.
Gee, it's good. Like, it's a really great insight. So for any of our listeners, it's very, very interesting. I'll look Cleo Brown up and get a copy of this charter because it's, I think, incredibly fascinating.
So Cleo's moved, funnily enough, into Muay Thai, and now she's a fighter. And she's an gymnast. She's incredible. So there's so much to read about Cleo, but yeah.
Okay, that's so interesting. So look, obviously that is so applicable to a career situation. You mentioned that and I think your journey is so interesting. You're not sure that you can do the role. You take the role. You're not sure that you can do the next role, and you get some great mentors. What, mentoring is this dark art of, difficult to describe, but who are these people and what is it? What would you describe that mentoring as?
So in my case, my mentor is the most opposite person to me as you could ever imagine, in that he is a middle-aged white male that is often labelled as many things that he's not. So that often he's labelled as a misogynist, and often he's labelled as a bully, and he's very, very direct, and he's quite a bigger guy. He's quite imposing, but has an incredible history and experience in business and growing businesses. And I guess for me, it was about kind of leaning into someone who was really different from me and who would have a different perspective and pull me up on things that I do sometimes to get away from, making hard and difficult decisions, or, being too kind when sometimes in business you can't be. And it has been one of the best kind of learning experiences of my life. And so he's actually my chairman, my current chairman, Mark Brody, who is actually known for running a string of franchises in chickens called Brody's Chickens. He's now out of that and he runs an investment firm. But I would say he's by far, he has been probably one of the most pivotal people in my life.
So it's really interesting, and so for a young person, I always avoid the gender discussion because I like people, and I think so often if people can treat people well as people, then everything else falls away. But it's quite interesting there to get a person who's older, who's different, and to know that person rather than the labels that people can use to try and shorthand a discussion about a person, but to give you some courage to push you along, to give you some belief that you don't necessarily, that isn't native to, I think, anyone. I think often people see people and go, oh yeah, that they've always been like that. It's consistent in the stories of great people I've met, is that there's someone that's given them a shove in the right direction when they weren't sure. It's so interesting. So you come into this role, you've been in it for 6 years now. The title CEO also has all sorts of connotations for people. What have you felt as a leader and as a leader in a significant organisation are the things that have made the most difference for you?
I think the things that have made the most difference have been probably the freedom to make choices for the benefit of our workers and obviously our stakeholders and our members, because I don't think you get that in a lot of roles. And so what I mean by that is sometimes the best and the right thing to do is to swim upstream. And so, for example, we are the only employer association that supported domestic and family violence leave. And the reason for that is because we were also one of the only employer associations that went and did the figures and looked at the analytics and looked at the actual costs per store. And so we know in retail, because of our demographics, it costs our retailers about $1,200 per store a year, because you can find what you're looking for in data if you know what you're looking for. And so I guess it was the freedom to make those kinds of decisions with the backing of a board and a chairman that had complete faith that I would make the right decisions, and the right decisions based on, you know, the demographics of our industry and of our members, and that I could prove, I guess, the business cases for that. But I also think, for me, CEOs always have personas, right? And as a CEO, if I had to describe mine, it is really about that cultural element and people, and getting the best out of people. I'm very good at that. And when I first took over the NRA, it was a very, very different place. You know, it had quite siloed teams. People didn't necessarily talk to each other. We were in a very kind of strange building where you could hide and people would never know that you were there. People wouldn't say hello to each other, etc. And it's almost about creating an environment where people feel safe to be vulnerable, and that they know when they are vulnerable, you know, that you'll back them in and you'll look after them. And that has made all the difference in everything that we've done, whether it's with our staff or whether it's with the people that we support. So an example of that is recently, obviously because of lockdown, we work very closely with a business called Retail Global, which is an events business. And they ran their national conference on the Gold Coast, as they've been doing for 25 years. And Brisbane went into lockdown, which meant that people wouldn't come. So they had to run these roadshows around the country. And unfortunately, last week they ran a roadshow in Melbourne. And the Brisbane event was the following day, which meant that they couldn't come because we basically shut our borders. The NRA went and delivered that event on their behalf because it was the right thing to do, and because it meant that their business could keep going. And that's how we view everything with our members, you know, with everything. And it's having the freedom, I think, to make the right decision for people that has made all the difference.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So, a lot of people say that, you know, they care about their people and that they're a people-led organisation. And right from your first comment, that there are lawyers, and then there are people that work as lawyers. You know, there's very little in the world that doesn't involve people, and yet it's easy to lose that. To try and get people to work together and create a safe space. I've often said that, you know, people's workplace might be the only safe place they have. And it could well be the safest place they have, where they can be most themselves, that, you know, they can be something different to what their families or friends or others have projected as, you know, who they should be when they grow up. But creating that safe place, you know, has as much to do with clear boundaries and some of the hard stuff as much as the soft stuff. Which is, you know, what's acceptable. You know, I took this list of non-negotiables. You know, who do you want to be? Who do we want you to be when you're at work? How do we want you to treat each other? That everyone in the gym, you know, is equally entitled to be there, whether they're experienced or not, and they should be respectfully treated, and people should know their names because they're not a thing, they're a person. The crossover, I think, is real. If in your role you're successful, how, in your mind, how would you know?
I think the people under you, honestly, I think it's about whether they're successful. And that's how I define success. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm here to make people the best version of themselves, whether that's with us or without us. But if the people under me are successful, if the teams under me are doing well, then I'm doing well, because, you know, I've allowed them to do that, or I've facilitated the ability for them to make those decisions and to kind of, you know, almost design their own destiny, because I think where people are invested, you get a better outcome.
And so to get that to happen, are you personally still involved in performance mentoring, recruitment? How hands-on to the people are you?
So I am reasonably hands-on in the sense that I'm obviously very accessible. You know, we have a reasonable sized team in that, you know, we never really go over 50 people. Anyone can access me at any time, whether it's text or email or, you know, however they want to communicate. If things get really hard, you know, within a team, they can always come to me, and my door is always open. But really, what I actually do is empower my leaders more than anything. And it's more about, what do you think? What's your recommendation? Why are you saying that? And okay, how can we make that happen? And we try and make that happen together. And it's about also right-sizing, I think, staff for teams. So the people that I would hire, are not always the best people for a particular team or a particular manager to manage. And it's really about allowing people, I guess, the freedom to make those decisions and to kind of, give them the respect and trust that they can make them, because that's what you employ them to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So when you look forward, if I think when you look back and you're talking to your Year 12 self, that's an interesting conversation. When you look forward, how do you think of the future? Do you, I love, you probably know Michael Hill from Michael Hill Jewelers. He's got a great book called Toughen Up. Talks about his 30-year plan. Really, really interesting guy. But do you, are you of the school of thought that you should have a 30-year direction for your life as to who you want to be when you grow up, or do you think of it as more letting things take you as they will? Are you looking to be pre-selected for federal parliament? What's the future?
I'm definitely not looking to be pre-selected. I have no interest in running for politics.
They're looking for women, Dominique.
I know they are, but not this one. Watch out. Not this woman. What do I do? For me, the 30-year plan is not something that I do. I don't plan that far ahead. I actually base it more on the fact that I want to be fulfilled and I want to enjoy my life, right? And I am not what I do. I'm a lot of things. And so for me, it's about the right opportunities presenting themselves at the right time. And I guess being open to taking those opportunities as they present. I just, like I said, I do really enjoy change, and I really do enjoy a challenge. But at the same time, whilst I'm an incredibly planned and organised person in everything else in my life, when it comes to the future, I do really feel that sometimes it's about, right place, right time, that has absolutely nothing to do with you. And for me, it's just about really being open, I guess, to those opportunities as they present, and being fearless enough to say, yeah, you know what, let's give this a crack. So that's kind of how I approach it. I don't have a 30-year plan, and I'm definitely not going into politics.
I've got that, guys. I've got that on video. I've got that on the podcast. There it is. I can see a political future for you. Now, talk to me about your Women's Legal Service Queensland, passionate advocate for victims of domestic violence. What is this thing, and what do we do about it?
Well, Women's Legal Service in Queensland is a pro bono or a not-for-profit legal service that provides free advice to women and children experiencing domestic and family violence. It has existed since 1984 and has an incredible history, where it was started as a women's space that's operated by all women, for women, and for the benefit of women. And they practice in areas across, family law, domestic and family violence, sexual violence, child abuse, child protection, anything in that space, including now financial abuse and also migration law. So I guess, when we think about what is this thing, domestic and family violence? At the moment, it's at epidemic levels. And I guess the more we speak about it and the more we talk about what it is and how it is, the demand is increasing exponentially. So Women's Legal Service in Queensland is the largest of its kind in the country. At the moment, they service 9,000 women a year, and 16,000 women a year are trying to access them. So we're missing 9,000 a year. And so it's this constant battle around demand, versus men.
What is the demand? So, Dominique, it's such an interesting area. What constitutes these crimes, if you like, and what are the services required? You've mentioned the domestic and family violence leave. What can people do? Because it seems, it's almost like it feels a little like mental illness, which it does feel like we've gone from a situation of shame and silence around mental illness to, everyone's mentally ill, including people that, have titles and live in palaces, and don't appear to be starving or facing any imminent threat to the basics required for existence. Unlike 9/10 of the world, those types of people. So how do we avoid a situation where the problem feels so big that people sort of throw their hands up and say, well, what can you do?
It's definitely, it feels insurmountable, but I think that everyone plays a role in this, including parents teaching their children about consent and teaching them about simply interacting with each other in a respectful manner. I think that, at the moment, there's a lot of discussion around things like coercive control, which is certainly, something that we know it plays a lot of a role in most situations where unfortunately, there ends up in a murder or something like that. But I think everyone plays a role. So, for instance, we know that lots of things are falling into the kind of the hands of business, and the National Retail Association has actually developed.
Or teachers.
Pardon?
It's either the teachers or the businesses.
Or the businesses.
The schools or the businesses.
That's right.
Like there's no one else.
No. And so we've developed a whole raft of materials that help small business in particular deal with something like this. So if someone comes and makes a disclosure, if you have a perpetrator in the workplace, how to keep people's privacy protected, what to do in the scenario where someone does leave and then goes back, because we know that she's likely to go back at least 7 times before she leaves. And just working through all of those employment issues that occur. Can you move rosters? Can you move them to another location? How do you keep that quiet? How do you ask somebody if they're experiencing domestic and family violence? What do you do if they make a disclosure? Who can you send them to? And so this all sits on a very public website that's attached to our website that small businesses can access. But in saying that, it's about really knowing where to refer someone and to believe them when they make a disclosure. Because, we know with child abuse victims, for example, that kids will make disclosures up to 7 times before they're believed. And certainly with women, they're very, very fearful, because a lot of the time, if they are in a situation like that, their self-esteem is very low. They've been isolated. They don't have anywhere to go. And sometimes work is the only place that they can go that is safe. So making sure that businesses are obviously set up to know what to do if someone makes a disclosure and know where to send them to. And so there's lots of elements of that. There's social work elements, there's obviously legal elements, because often women are the carers of children. So there's a lot of family law and things like that involved. But there's also a whole raft of other things around, finances and having access to money.
So we're in the financial advice business. When, I'm hearing the sort of financial abuse term more often now than I have in the past. What is it? How do you spot it? What do you do about it? And how should couples really run their money? Which is, if I guess I've been at this 28 years, I've met thousands of couples. It's certainly not taught at school, just personal finance for an individual. So most individuals don't have clear ideas about how to run their money. And then they get into a partnership with someone else who has no clear ideas. And it's a recipe for disaster, in my view.
It definitely, especially where there is an inequality in terms of earning capacities, especially if one, is the primary carer of children who isn't working as much or earning as much superannuation and things like that. So it's really about making sure that both parties have a sense of independence and access to an independent financial state outside of the couple. So that nobody can restrict that person from being able to, I guess, fend for themselves if they have to. That's really the lesson. It's about teaching that, whilst you might be part of a couple, whilst you might choose to pool your funds to do a number of things, that it's also important to preserve your independence, especially, if you are a woman. And I think, and I only say that because we know the statistics are skewed that way. And that's not to say that men shouldn't have financial independence as well, but it's really about making sure that in the event of an emergency, you would be able to make some very swift decisions and be able to access funds, if you have the ability to do so. And if you don't, knowing where you can go to seek some of that assistance.
So how do we make that practical? Like, I sit with couples, should they have a joint bank account? Should they not have a joint bank account? These are the discussions I've sat in for years. It's unlikely that they have a mortgage that doesn't rely on both of their incomes. They have household expenditure that is joint expenditure. But I see, I've often said that the two major reasons cited for partnerships breaking down are number one, communication, and number two, finances. I always say it's communication about finances because it really reveals people's values to a huge degree. And when you think about coercive controls, you'll see that around money. If you say, great, how are we going to run the money? We're going to put it together. We're going to put it apart. You're going to have a bank account. I'm going to have a bank account. How are we going to do it? Is there any material that anyone's produced that you're aware of that sort of recommends that structure or some type of structure?
They don't recommend a type of structure to prevent it from occurring because, I think that most people go into these things at a time where either it's not occurring or you're not aware that it started to occur. And so when
or even that it can occur.
Well, that's right. And when we see things like financial abuse, it can be, it can go as far as, failing to provide money for food, for the partner or for the children unless or upon condition, things like that, or racking up debts in the other person's name.
So that's the one I see. Like I actually don't see control. I see flagrantly disgraceful financial behavior, overspending, running up debts, and it causes huge conflict.
And so there's a lot of support around the back end about how to get you out of a scenario like that. And there's not a lot of support around, I think, educating women, around, simply building themselves independence or making sure those things don't happen, or even talking about what we call sexually transmitted debt, because that's, something that, as you say, we don't do a lot of education around financial literacy. We don't do a lot of education around, basically protecting your financial security.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I think it's one for the future, especially if you look at the rates of breakdown and all the rest of it. Well, that is very, very interesting, Dominique. Thank you so much for your time today. I love to always ask people a particular question, normally right at the end, a motto, quote, or thought that best summarizes your approach to life. It's the worst question without notice, right?
No, it's not really. So Dolly Parton, I never quit trying and I never tried quitting.
That's a great quote. I've really enjoyed our time today. Thank you so much for making the time, Dominique. I hope all of our listeners have found our discussion as interesting as I have. I love to get people who've got interesting life experience, and I think Dominique is a great example to people for so many reasons. Thank you so much for today, and I look forward to catching up again. Have a great day.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off Show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.